The chamber was meant to be orderly, the kind of place where words are weighed carefully before they fall. But that day, the air cracked with hostility. Senator Rick Scott leaned into his microphone, his tone sharp, his words sharper still. With a smirk curling at the edges of his mouth, he unleashed an insult aimed squarely at Representative Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just a political jab, it was personal, dismissive, dripping with arrogance. The room froze. A low gasp rippled through. The rows of aides and onlookers, pens halted mid-scribble. Even a few senators shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, unsure if they had just witnessed a line cross too far. The insult didn't just sting, it scorched, meant to humiliate, to reduce, to remind Crockett of the hierarchy Scott believed she had no right to challenge. And yet, at that very moment, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rush to fire back or let outrage flare across her face. Instead, she paused. The kind of pause that stretched and thickened the air. She raised her gaze, steady and unyielding, fixing Scott with a stare that was both calm and cutting. A silent reminder that dignity has its own power. The silence became its own spectacle. Staffers leaned toward each other, whispering in urgent tones. A camera panned, catching the uneasy shuffling of senators who suddenly looked smaller, less certain. Even Scott himself shifted back in his chair, as if confronted not with a reply, but with something heavier, the weight of composure under fire. That pause held longer than anyone expected. It was a moment where time seemed suspended, the insult still hanging in the air like smoke, but the room already waiting for its collapse. Crockett's eyes never wavered. Her silence speaking louder than any interruption could. The chamber wasn't witnessing a victim of words. It was witnessing a storm gather behind stillness, a strength that refused to be rushed or rattled. And in that held breath, the balance of power quietly tilted. But no one, not even Rick Scott, expected what came next. What had begun as a verbal jab was quickly revealed to be something larger, something that went beyond the sharp insult Rick Scott hurled across the chamber. This was not banter. This was not routine sparring. This was a collision over who gets to define dignity in American politics. Rick Scott entered this debate wrapped in the confidence of entrenched power, a long-serving senator, fortified by deep-pocketed allies and aligned with the arrogance of Trump-era conservatism. He embodied a political machine that treated dominance as destiny. To his base, Scott symbolized unwavering defiance, someone who would sneer at norms and bulldoze over opponents with the assurance that power excused arrogance. His insult toward Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate display of hierarchy, a seasoned senator telling a younger, black congresswoman that her voice was not equal to his. Asterisk. But Jasmine Crockett was not merely a congresswoman in this moment. She was standing as the voice of communities long dismissed, disrespected, and disenfranchised. She carried the grit of the courtroom where she had defended clients who had no one else. She carried the fire of Texas battles against voter suppression. The unshakable presence of a woman who had faced uglier slurs and steeper odds. To the people watching beyond those walls, Americans who had felt silenced, erased, or ignored, Crockett was not just speaking for herself. She was speaking for them. The stakes were no longer confined to the chamber. This was a battle over whether politics in America would remain a theater of arrogance, or whether truth, dignity, and courage could reclaim their place at its center. It was about democracy itself, whether it would bend under the weight of intimidation, or rise through the steadiness of those who refused to be silenced. Every theme was alive in that standoff. Women's rights, the legacy of race in America. The fragile promise of truth in a political landscape drowning in slogans and spin. Crockett's silence, her stare, her composure at all, became an act of defiance. She was proving that dignity is not handed down by titles or seniority. It is defined by the courage to face down condescension without bowing to it. Around the nation, screens flickered with live coverage. Some saw Scott's arrogance and nodded, content with the old order. Others, however, leaned closer, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. This wasn't the typical script where a senator lectures and a representative retreats. It was the disruption of that script. Disruption is always dangerous to power, because when arrogance meets composure, arrogance eventually trembles. When an insult meets silence, silence can echo louder than thunder. And when hierarchy is challenged by dignity, dignity, if it holds, can win. In that chamber, it was no longer just Rick Scott versus Jasmine Crockett. It was power versus truth. Arrogance versus dignity. A senator cloaked in seniority versus a woman forged in struggle. And with every word, the weight of America pressed down on the chamber. Rick Scott did not stumble into power, he built it, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, polished into the image of success by a system that rewarded cold calculation over compassion. His story begins not in the neighborhoods where people fought for survival, but in the gleaming towers of corporate boardrooms, where balance sheets mattered more than families and profit eclipsed people. Before the Senate, before the governors, Mansion Scott was the businessman who rose through the ranks of American capitalism with a relentless, almost mechanical drive. He cultivated the kind of smile that looked friendly on television, yet felt sharp enough to cut glass. That smile carried the weight of practiced disdain. A corporate grin honed to reassure investors while quietly signaling superiority. His wealth was not incidental, it was central. In the 1990s, Scott oversaw one of the largest healthcare companies. In America, on paper, it was an empire. Behind the curtain, it became infamous for one of the largest Medicare fraud cases in U.S. history. Billions were siphoned. Regulators descended, and though Scott managed to dodge personal criminal charges, the stain was permanent. To critics, it revealed everything about his character. A man who would enrich himself at the expense of the vulnerable, and step away untouched, shielded by lawyers and loopholes. To his supporters, however, he was proof of the American dream. A man who played hard, won big, and survived scandal. That duality defined Rick Scott's rise. He turned controversy into fuel, transforming corporate greed into political credibility. When he ran for governor of Florida, he styled himself as the outsider, the businessman who knew how to run government like a company. The line resonated in a political climate hungry for disruption. Scott wrote it straight into the State House. As governor, his policies bore the same imprint as his business career. Ruthless efficiency for the wealthy, dismissive austerity for the vulnerable. He pushed tax cuts favoring corporations and slashed funding for social programs. Public schools groaned under cuts. Healthcare access shrank even as Scott's own history with healthcare profiteering lingered in headlines. For him, governing was never about empathy. It was about numbers, about projecting strength, about tightening his grip. And yet, what truly marked Scott was not just his record, but his style. He was not fiery like some of his Trumpist colleagues, nor charismatic in the way of a born showman. Instead, his weapon was arrogance cloaked in calm, a smug interruption here, a dismissive chuckle there. He was the man who leaned back in his chair, certain of his superiority, waiting for opponents to stumble so he could swoop in with rehearsed authority. His voice carried the cadence of boardrooms and press conferences, smooth but cutting, polished but hollow. When Scott eventually leapt to the Senate, he carried with him the same persona, corporate polished entitlement, dressed as leadership. On the Senate floor, he wielded interruptions like daggers. In debates, he often didn't need to shout, his weapon was belittlement. The steady drip of dismissal that communicated, "You don't belong here, but I do." This was the man Jasmine Crockett faced. It's not merely a senator, but a figure sculpted by decades of entitlement and shielded by money, power, and the belief that those shields could never crack. To him, Crockett was a target made for condescension. A younger black woman, outspoken, principled, unwilling to shrink. For Scott, the calculation was simple: belittle her, interrupt her, frame her as out of her depth, watch the chamber nod along. But Scott underestimated the danger of his own arrogance. His career had taught him that scandals faded, that money could buy silence, that titles guaranteed respect. He had been proven right for decades, yet what he faced now was not just another political opponent. It was someone who embodied the voices his brand of politics had worked tirelessly to suppress. Crockett was not intimidated by corporate polished smiles or Senate seniority. She had fought battles on far harsher terrain Texas courtrooms where the deck was stacked. legislative halls where her voice was dismissed, streets where injustice did not wait for polite debate. Scott leaned on the confidence of money and power. But history shows us that arrogance built on money and power always meets its match. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in the marbled halls of Congress or under the bright lights of television cameras. It begins in the trenches, where the fight for dignity and justice is messy, unglamorous, and relentless. Where victories are measured not in headlines, but in the relief of a single mother who kept her home, or the exhale of a young man spared from a broken system's grinding gears. Before she was a congresswoman, Crockett was a public defender, kind who walked into cramped courtrooms where the scales of justice tilted heavily against her clients before a word was even spoken. She saw firsthand the machinery of inequality, overworked defenders, prosecutors who treated poor defendants like disposable statistics, and judges who barely concealed their impatience. Yet Crockett never flinched. She stood in those courts as if her voice alone could force the system to listen. Day after day, she defended those society had discarded. She represented the accused who couldn't afford a lawyer, often facing cases stacked with evidence born of poverty, bias, and broken policing. There was little glamour in it. The pay was low, the hours endless, and the defeats frequent. But for Crockett, it was more than a job. It was survival transformed into purpose. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be told the odds were insurmountable. She carried that weight into every hearing, every argument, every stare exchanged. With a judge who dismissed her client before she opened her mouth, when she shifted into civil rights law, her battles only grew sharper. In Texas, a state that seemed determined to test the limits of voter suppression, Crockett became a shield and a sword. She fought cases where the right to vote was on trial, where communities of color were targeted by maps and policies designed to silence them. Each lawsuit was more than a legal proceeding. It was a statement of defiance. In press conferences and rallies, she spoke with fire, her words cutting through the excuses of those who insisted disenfranchisement was just politics. But Crockett wasn't only defined by the cases she fought. She was defined by the way she fought them, with wit that cut deeper than insults and composure that rattled even the most polished opponents. She wielded language like a blade. Where others shouted, she steadied her voice. Where arrogance filled the air, she stared it down. Her eyes could quiet a room faster than a gavel. Those who worked alongside her remember the way she carried herself in tense hearings, calm but unyielding. A presence that communicated, "I will not be dismissed, and neither will those I represent." In those moments, she wasn't simply a lawyer. She was the embodiment of resistance, a voice's long silence suddenly refusing to shrink. Her rise to Congress was not the story of someone handpicked by the establishment. It was the story of an underdog who turned her survival into strength. In Texas, she faced attacks that went beyond politics, attacks on her race, her gender, her very right to hold power. Opponents painted her as too radical, too outspoken, too unwilling to know her place. But Crockett leaned into those labels. Every insult hurled her way became fuel. Every attempt to diminish her only made her stand taller. When she won her seat in Congress, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement to every young girl who had been told she didn't belong, to every immigrant family told to wait their turn, to every community told their vote didn't count. Her victory was a message. Dignity is not granted by power. It is claimed by those who refuse to bow. And yet, even in Washington, she carried with her the lessons of those early courtrooms. She knew what it meant to be underestimated. She knew what it meant to have to claw for recognition in rooms where arrogance sat at the head of the table. In every committee hearing, in every debate, she bore the scars and strength of those experiences. Crockett's weapon was never bluster. It was precision. When others resorted to noise, she wielded clarity. When arrogance tried to drown her out, she silenced it not by shouting, but by staring straight through it. That stare, steady, unflinching, had ended more tirades than any rebuttal. It was the same stare that once quieted a judge mid-sentence in a Texas courtroom. The same stare that now, on the national stage, made even the most confident adversaries falter. So when Rick Scott launched his insult across the Senate chamber, Crockett did not flinch. She had endured worse. She had faced dismissals more cutting than words, systemic dismissals, institutional. Dismissals backed by power, privilege, and prejudice. What was one senator's smirk compared to decades of injustice she had already battled? Every insult endured, every courtroom battle fought. Every stare that forced arrogance into silence, it had all been training for this very moment. And as the chamber held its breath, waiting for her reply, Crockett stood ready not just to answer Rick Scott, but to remind America who she truly was. The chamber had grown heavy with unease, but Rick Scott wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth like a man who believed he'd already won. His voice carried a polished smugness, sharpened by years of boardrooms and campaign stages. Every interruption came not with the curiosity of debate, but with the practiced cadence of dismissal. "Congresswoman, you're out of your depth," he said, letting the words drip into the microphone. The remark was designed not to persuade, but to belittle, to remind the room who, in his mind, held the power. Staffers scribbled notes with unnecessary intensity, their pens trembling just slightly, as though avoiding the spectacle. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of expression, every twitch in the senator's jaw. Journalists shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of something volatile about to ignite. Scott pressed on. "This isn't some community forum. This is the Senate floor. Perhaps if you had a bit more experience, you'd understand the gravity of the discussion." He let the pause linger, basking in his own performance. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't snap back with a barrage of words. Instead, she sat utterly still, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Every second she refused to engage only magnified the arrogance pouring from Scott's mouth. Her calm created a mirror, forcing his condescension to echo louder and louder in the chamber. The tension thickened. Aides avoided eye contact, as if locking eyes with anyone else might betray the discomfort building in the room. Whispers rippled through the gallery, a hushed chorus of disbelief that this was happening so openly. Scott leaned forward now, his voice dropping lower, more pointed. Dripping with contempt, "You should sit this one out. Let the adults handle it." The words landed like a slap. A gasp cut through the chamber, audible even above the senator's smug cadence. It was the kind of insult that didn't just attack a colleague, it attacked her dignity, her legitimacy. Her very presence in that room, Crockett's eyes, steady and sharp, lifted to meet his. For a heartbeat, the noise of the chamber seemed to collapse into silence. Her gaze locked on him, not with rage, but with an almost surgical precision. It was the stare she had honed over years in hostile courtrooms, the stare that said, "I see. You. I see everything you're trying to hide." Scott shifted in his chair, just slightly. The confidence remained painted on his face, but something in his posture betrayed that flicker of unease. Still, he kept going. "This is politics, not theater. Maybe if you stopped playing to the cameras, you'd understand." But it was he who had been performing. Every exaggerated pause, every smug smile, every jab, it was theater, and everyone knew it. The chamber felt like a stage waiting for the final act. Crockett remained silent, letting his words unravel into the air. And with every insult he layered on, the suspense deepened. Senators on both sides shifted uncomfortably. The arrogance was suffocating, and yet Crockett's refusal to bite back only fueled the anticipation. The longer she waited, the more the audience leaned in. What was she thinking? When would she speak? The cameras captured her stillness, her patience, her composure. In contrast to Scott's restless swagger, she appeared unshakable, a storm gathering behind a calm horizon. And then, slowly, deliberately, Crockett leaned forward. Her eyes, blazing with resolve, locked onto Scott's with the force of 1,000. Unspoken rebuttals. The chamber held its breath, waiting for the silence to break. What came next would not just be a response. It would be a reckoning. The silence stretched so long, it felt like the entire chamber was holding its breath. Even the scratch of pens against notepads had ceased. Rick Scott's smug grin remained fixed, but the stillness of Jasmine Crockett, her refusal to answer immediately, began to twist that grin into something more brittle. And then she spoke. Just one line. Low, deliberate, every syllable cutting through the stagnant air like a blade. Senator, the difference between us is simple. You mistake power for respect while I earn mine. The words rang out not as a shout, but as a verdict. For a split second, the chamber was stunned into absolute stillness. It was as if a gavel had struck. Every eye flicked toward Rick Scott, and for the first time all day, the mask of corporate polished arrogance faltered. His smirk wavered, his shoulders stiffened. The flinch was subtle, but undeniable. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The kind that couldn't be suppressed, the kind born from watching a tide turn in an instant. Staffers who had been shrinking into their chairs suddenly sat taller. Aides froze mid-no, pens hovering uselessly above the page. It wasn't just the line. It was the timing. Crockett had let him puff himself up, let him revel in his own sneering cadence, only to dismantle him with fewer words than he had wasted. Scott tried to recover. His mouth opened as if to retort, but the room's energy shifted against him. Crockett wasn't finished. You sit here, Senator, believing your title shields you, believing a bank account buys wisdom, that a polished insult makes you untouchable. But the truth is every word you've thrown at me says more about your fear than my fitness to serve. The murmurs grew louder now, like wind picking up before a storm. Scott's jaw clenched. His practiced disdain seemed less like confidence and more like desperation. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. Her tone wasn't theatrical, was surgical, each word precise, each pause weighted with intent. You tell me to sit down? Be silent. To let the adults handle it. Well, let me remind you, real adults, don't mock women doing the work. Real adults don't build empires on fraud and then lecture the children of immigrants on integrity. Real adults, she leaned, and just slightly, voice cutting lower, fiercer, know when their time is up. The chamber erupted not in applause, because decorum restrained it, but in sound nonetheless. Gasps, murmurs, a chorus of whispered disbelief spilling over the gallery and benches. Aides exchanged glances that needed no words. Cameras zoomed tighter, hungry for every flicker of Scott's face as he tried and failed to mask the impact. Scott shifted in his seat again, tugging at his jacket, his lips pressed tight. He wanted to interrupt, to reassert control. He couldn't. Not this time. Back. Crockett had seized the rhythm. She pressed forward, her voice steady, her cadence rising with quiet conviction. You can sneer at me. You can interrupt me. You can even insult me on record. But what you cannot do, what you will never do, is erase the truth that brought me here. I came from courtrooms where my clients didn't have the money to buy justice, but they had the right to it, and I fought for them every time. That fight doesn't shrink in this chamber, it grows. Her words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a mirror, forcing the room to see Scott for what he was, not a statesman, but a man clinging to borrowed authority. One of the reporters seated in the back let out an involuntary whispered, "Wow." The sound was swallowed quickly, but not before it joined the pulse racing through the room. Scott blinked hard, struggling to recompose. He tried to laugh, a dismissive scoff, but it cracked halfway, sounding hollow. Crockett didn't need to gloat. She didn't raise her volume, didn't revel in his discomfort. Instead, she sat back slightly, reclaiming the poise she had held all along. Her silence after the clapback spoke louder than anything Scott could muster, and then just when it seemed she might let the moment rest, she leaned in one last time, delivering the line that landed like a closing argument, final and undeniable, when men like you tell women like me to sit down, history only remembers the ones who stood tall. The chamber broke. Gasps turned to low murmurs, murmurs to open exclamations. The energy was electric, uncontrolled, as if a current had passed through. The Senate itself, Clerks exchanged wide-eyed stares. Aides whispered furiously into phones. Even some senators shifted uncomfortably, knowing the weight of what had just happened. Scott sat frozen, his face caught between defiance and defeat, but neither expression fully convincing. His hand fidgeted against the desk, tapping once, then stopping. The arrogance had cracked. Crockett, meanwhile, remained calm. Her composure was intact, her breathing steady. She had not needed volume or venom, just clarity, just truth. And in that chamber, clarity sounded louder than any insult. The reporters would seize on this moment. Clips would be cut, hashtags written, the scene replayed across news cycles before the day was done. But inside the chamber, in real time, everyone knew what they had witnessed. It was not merely a rebuttal, it was a reversal. The balance of power in that room had shifted not in titles, not in hierarchy, but in perception. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, reverent, even fearful. The kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the air is still crackling with its aftershocks. Scott tried once more to speak, but his words came out faltering, mumbled into the microphone. They didn't land. They didn't matter. Crockett's eyes, unflinching, stayed locked forward, not even on Scott anymore. She wasn't speaking to him now. She was speaking to history, and as the chamber tried to collect itself, as aides scrambled to document the exchange, the truth hung in the air like smoke after fire. One line, one woman, had cut through the fortress of arrogance and left it trembling. But outside those walls, the aftershocks would be even bigger. By the time Crockett left the chamber, the moment had already broken free of its marble walls. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere cut, captioned, remixed, and replayed on millions of screens. Twitter lit up first, hashtags sparking like wildfire, hashtag Crockett via Scott, hashtag clapback queen, hashtag respect turned. Each one a rallying cry. Each one tethering Crockett's calm takedown to a digital avalanche of validation. The video spread with a rhythm of its own. One account posted it with the caption, "This is how you silence arrogance with dignity." Another wrote, "Rick Scott just got schooled in real time. Jasmine Crockett equals unshakable." The retweets spiraled into the tens of thousands. Soon, the clip was stitched into TikToks, paired with triumphant soundtracks, turned into memes where Scott's faltering face became a punchline. But it wasn't just ordinary users. The ripple hit the media in full force. On Fox News, anchors sat with tight jaws, labeling the exchange disrespectful and unbecoming of a congresswoman. One pundit sneered, "She doesn't know her place. This kind of grandstanding is dangerous." The framing was clear. Dismiss Crockett's strength as defiance. Turn her composure into a threat. MSNBC, however, framed it as something entirely different. Their chyron blared. Historic moment. Crockett stands tall against Scott. Commentators called it a turning point in modern political discourse, a rare instance where silence, timing, and truth cut deeper than shouting. Asterisk, she didn't just respond, one analyst said. She flipped the power dynamic in real time. That's rare. Celebrities chimed in, lending their voices to the swelling tide. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "Grace, precision, strength. That's how you do it." Kerry Washington added, "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." Jasmine Crockett reminded us all what leadership looks like. Even LeBron James reposted the clip with 3 simple words, "Say it. Loud." It's pastors weighed in too, especially from black churches across the country. Sunday sermons echoed Crockett's words, framing them as an affirmation of dignity over dominance. One pastor in Atlanta told his congregation when Senator Scott tried to belittle her, she responded not with venom, but with vision. And vision is what God gives us to withstand arrogance. Legal scholars dissected her phrasing, marveling at its precision. The a Harvard law profaming it a master class in rhetorical, more a redefinition of the battlefield. Crockett, he argued, had not only defended herself, but had shifted the very terms of the debate. Meanwhile, Rick Scott was absorbing the fallout. Clips of his faltering grin circulated alongside mocking captions. When the arrogance runs out. Late-night comedians seized on the moment, turning his flinch into a recurring gag. Memes compared him to glass shattering under pressure, to a salesman caught in his own pitch. The image of a man long propped up by wealth and title had cracked hand. The internet was gleeful in prying it wider. Pollsters noted the sudden surge in Crockett's name recognition. Overnight, she had vaulted from rising voice to household name.
Ow.
Text chains buzzed with her quotes. Group chats circulated the video. Like atrophy. One college student told a reporter, "She said what every woman in America has wanted to say to guys like him. That's why it hit so hard." But amid the laughter and praise, a deeper current was moving. Beneath the hashtags and memes, the moment was being framed as something larger than a single exchange. Commentators began asking, what does this say? About power in America? Who gets to define dignity? What happens when someone outside the gilded establishment not only enters the arena, but owns it? Scott's camp scrambled to respond. His office released a statement calling Crockett unprofessional and radical, but the tone only fueled the fire. Every word of dismissal reminded people of the very arrogance she had exposed. The pushback didn't land, it only amplified. Her victory in community centers, in classrooms, in living rooms across the country, people were replaying the clip, not just for entertainment, but for affirmation. 8. A teacher in Texas showed it to her students as an example of composure under fire. A mother in Detroit told her daughter, "See? That's how you hold your ground." The chamber moment had become cultural shorthand. A story retold not for its politics alone, but for its message. Respect isn't given by title. It's earned by truth. And as the memes multiplied, networks replayed the exchange on loop, as Rick Scott's smile became a national punchline. The resonance grew louder, deeper, because beneath the humor, beneath the viral frenzy, something more profound was echoing nationwide, something Rick Scott never intended to unleash. Trophy, one college student told a reporter. She said what every woman in America has wanted to say to guys like him. That's why it hit so hard. But amid the laughter and praise, a deeper current was moving. Beneath the hashtags and memes, the moment was being framed as something larger than a single exchange. Commentators began asking, what does this say? About power in America. Who gets to define dignity? What happens when someone outside the gilded establishment not only enters the arena but owns it? Scott's camp scrambled to respond. His office released a statement calling Crockett unprofessional and radical, but the tone only fueled the fire. Every word of dismissal reminded people of the very arrogance she had exposed. Pushback didn't land. It only amplified her victory in community centers, in classrooms, in living rooms across the country. People were replaying the clip not just for entertainment, but for affirmation. A teacher in Texas showed it to her students as an example of composure under fire. A mother in Detroit told her daughter, "See? That's how you hold your ground." The chamber moment had become cultural shorthand. A story retold not for its politics alone, but for its message. Respect isn't given by title, it's earned by truth. And as the memes multiplied, as networks replayed the exchange on loop, as Rick Scott's smile became a national punchline, the resonance grew louder, deeper, because beneath the humor, beneath the viral frenzy, something more profound was echoing nationwide, something Rick Scott never intended to unleash. When Jasmine Crockett finally rose to speak after the storm of commentary, it was not with the fire of anger, nor the smugness of a victory lap. Instead, she carried herself with the gravity of someone who knew this was bigger than a soundbite. Her voice, steady and deliberate, reframed the entire clash into something larger than politics, something etched into the moral fabric of the country. "This isn't about me," she began, her words echoing with a calm certainty that silenced every whisper in the chamber. "And it's not about Senator Scott. This is about the truth. It's about whether we still believe in dignity as a nation." The room leaned forward. Staffers paused mid-note. Even cameras seemed to zoom in tighter, as though America itself was straining to hear, she continued, each line more measured than the last. Justice is not intimidation. Authority without truth crumbles. And arrogance, no matter how loud, will always fall silent when faced with courage. In that moment, Crockett wasn't merely defending herself. She was drawing a line in the sand for every woman who had been dismissed, every community that had been belittled, every voter who had been told they didn't matter. She had transformed Scott's attempt at humiliation into a universal lesson. Real power is not wealth, not title, not arrogance dressed up in a suit. Real power is the courage to speak truth when silence is expected. The chamber seemed suspended. In time, reporters scribbled furiously, but even their pens seemed slow to catch the weight of her words. Observers felt it deep in their bones. This was not just a rebuttal. This was a redefinition of what strength looks like in American politics. Crockett's closing words pierced with the force of history. When power tries to silence, it takes courage to remind the nation of its voice. And today, that voice belongs to every person who has ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to know their place. Our place is here. Our voice is now. And our dignity is not up for debate. For a moment, silence hung thick in the chamber, as though the air itself needed to absorb the truth. Then, like a wave breaking, came the sound. Soft applause at first, swelling into a roar of approval that rolled across the room, drowning out whatever protests might have lingered. Even those who disagreed with her politics could not deny the force of her conviction. This wasn't partisan bickering. It was something elemental, a reminder that democracy is not sustained by the loudest insult, but by the quiet courage to stand one's ground. Outside those walls, our words spread again. This time, not as a clapback, not as a meme, but as a rallying cry. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. Activists wove it into speeches. Parents repeated it to their children as proof that dignity is worth defending. And in the days that followed, the debate ceased to be framed as Crockett versus Scott. It became something far greater: arrogance versus dignity, intimidation versus justice, silence versus voice. And in that framing, it was clear who had won, because Crockett hadn't just silenced a senator. She had reminded America of itself, of its promise, of its unfinished work, of its relentless belief that courage can break through even the hardest walls of power. The clash would be replayed, analyzed, dissected. But for those who heard her, that day the meaning was already clear. Strength is not measured by the volume of your voice, but by the truth it carries. And so, as her words echoed far beyond the chamber, they left a lasting imprint not of division, but of resolve. A reminder that in a nation tested by arrogance and corruption, the moral compass still points true when guided by dignity. In America, Breathless was left to ask itself, if one voice could shift the ground beneath a senator, what might happen? If millions found the courage to do the same? Rick Scott tried to define the moment with arrogance. His insults, polished with the smugness of power, were meant to belittle and silence. But Jasmine Crockett met that fire with composure and unshakable dignity forged in battles far tougher than a Senate chamber exchange. And in the end, her viral clapback didn't just flip the debate. It flipped the narrative of who truly holds strength in American politics. That's why this story resonates far beyond the headlines. It isn't just about two politicians trading words. It's about a test, whether entitlement or dignity will shape the future. And as we saw, Crockett proved that truth delivered with courage always outlasts arrogance delivered with volume. Rick Scott insulted Jasmine Crockett, but her clapback didn't just silence him. It reminded the nation that history has always been shaped not by those who try to intimidate, but by those willing to rise, stand, and speak when silence is demanded. And now, the question is bigger than that chamber. It's about us, our voices, our courage, our willingness to carry this same spirit into every space where justice is on the line. If this moment struck you, if it reminded you of the power we all hold, then don't let it stop here. Subscribe. Now, to be part of this movement, share this video so others can feel the weight of dignity conquering arrogance. And join us at Viral Insight, where every story is more than just news. It's a reminder that the fight for truth and justice is alive in each of us, Because history isn't written by the loudest voice in the room. It's written by those who dare to speak truth when silence is demanded.